Hello, this is Father Morris. Glad to be here with you guys again. We just had some questions about Holy Communion. I thought I'd go ahead and answer them. So I want to start by reading from Sacred Scripture. This is St. Paul writing to the Corinthians. This was his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, where he's writing about the Lord's Supper, about Holy Communion, about the Mass. So in verse 27, starting, he says, "Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will have to answer for the body and blood of the Lord. A person should examine himself, and so eat the bread and drink the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself." So that's one of the scriptural sources that we have for our Catholic belief that the Eucharist is something to be respected and something that we need to take seriously in receiving Holy Communion. Now, some other Christian communities that are not Catholic have what's open communion, where basically anyone who attends receives. And they would say that Catholics have a more closed communion, saying that, if you're not a Catholic in good standing, you can't receive communion. Well, it's kind of derogatory a little bit, but they do have a point. And the point is that they're right that what they believe the Holy Communion to be should be given to all, because they believe it's just a symbol, it's just a remembrance, it's just a something to remind us of something we can't see. But there's nothing actually to it besides the belief of the believer. There's all sorts of beliefs across the broad spectrum of Christianity that would be called Protestantism, but generally speaking, they would agree that they do not believe what Catholics believe about the Eucharist. But we Catholics believe, of course, in real presence, that the body and the blood, soul, and divinity of Christ is truly present in the Eucharist. And so that's why we have even more fear and respect for how we treat the Eucharist and how we receive it, is because we believe that it's this great and holy gift, but something that we need to take very, very seriously. So that's why we believe, as Catholics, one, that you have to be old enough to understand what you're receiving, at least in the Latin Rite. And so that's why we wait until second grade, right, before people make their first communion. And before they go to communion, they have to do their first confession, because that's another integral part of receiving Holy Communion, is that we believe you should have your soul as clean as possible, according to your own knowledge, before you receive the Eucharist. So that's why we have first penance and then first Holy Communion. And it's the same then for adults, that if we are aware of any serious sin after our baptism, the way we fix that is by going to confession, and then we can go to Holy Communion. So we shouldn't go receive Holy Communion if we have any serious sin on our hearts, on our souls. And again, this is all because we respect the fact that the Eucharist is so great and mighty that we don't want to bring condemnation on ourselves by treating it, less than sacred, of not being as serious as we should in receiving it. And so sometimes when we feel like maybe we're being left out, there's a lot of Catholics actually that are left out too, because maybe they can't receive because they're not old enough yet, or they haven't been to confession, or they're in some irregular situation, or they haven't kept the communion fast. That's another thing people forget, is that you have to fast an hour before communion. You can only have water or medicine if you need it, according to your doctor. But if you haven't kept the fast, then you shouldn't receive communion either. And that's been greatly simplified. In the old days, you had to fast from midnight before you received Holy Communion. But obviously, especially when you start having evening masses, that makes it very difficult. So that's one of those strictly church rules that the Pope changed from midnight to just 3 hours now to just an hour, so more people can go and receive communion and not be hampered by the fast. But again, it's recognizing that the Eucharist is holy, and we shouldn't just receive it out of routine or without any seriousness, but rather that by receiving the Eucharist publicly, we're saying, I believe everything the Catholic Church teaches about this, and I have prepared myself to receive Holy Communion. And we wouldn't want to say that if we didn't believe it. And if we do believe it and we're not Catholic yet, then we should go ahead and start the process so we can become Catholic. But in the meantime, if we're not Catholic, we just always ask that you come forward with your arms crossed, and we will give you a blessing instead of Holy Communion. And then if you would like to receive Holy Communion, again, we ask you to go through the OCIA, the convert class, in order to do that. But again, it really comes down to, because the main confusion, I think, comes from other people go to other churches where it's much more everyone receives Holy Communion and there's no rules around it, versus the Catholic approach, which seems kind of mean, like we're limiting it. But it's just because we really do think that it's a core belief of ours that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. It's the real presence. It's really Jesus present. And so we need to have extra levels of care and respect. Whereas other churches, they don't believe that, and they'd be the first one to say we don't believe that in the real presence. And so it's not a big deal to them to just hand out communion to anybody and everyone. So that's the main difference. Again, if anyone has any questions, they can always ask one of us priests or the deacons, but or Deacon Tim. But it really comes down to that it's because we have so much respect for Holy Communion that we don't just offer communion to everyone, that we do believe you have to be prepared, and then you have to continue to be prepared in your life in order to receive the Eucharist worthily and well, and not bring condemnation upon yourself, and to respect the great gift that God's given us in the Eucharist. So I hope that clears things up, and talk to you soon again.